So I'm going to be talking about what we learned about virtual learning in a short time. And why are we doing that? Why are we sharing everything we learned for free with no holds barred and with no expectations? Well, COVID has affected us all. We're in a major difficulty, all of us, trying to keep our businesses going. The only way that we can really build a country effectively is, I think, by educating everyone well. And it's ridiculous with such a huge education need and so few educators that we enter in some sort of competitive dynamic. So our belief is we must support everybody else in their transition to virtual learning, help the country, and share everything we know. There'll be plenty of opportunity for all of us, and perhaps we'll learn something in the process as well. In fact, I'm sure we will. So that's why we're doing it. So first slide just shows a little bit about what we're doing. So we shifted 100% virtual in a couple of weeks. We did that because we had been thinking ahead and we were practicing our sort of skills of foresight, and we were awake to the realities of the situation. So we were scanning, keeping awake, thinking through, visualizing what's going to happen and making projections, and that was more or less accurate. So it matters hugely because the Gini coefficient is a very large is a very big problem in South Africa. We have more people trapped in poverty, and a largest more proportionally people trapped in poverty, and the largest differentiation between rich and poor people of any country in the world, which means we have a poverty trap of note. And that poverty trap is also an education trap. We literally cannot build a decent nation without educating everybody very well, and people need to be confident in their own abilities. So we need to help each other develop methods that are going to give access to education for everybody, and a type of education that people can use and it's helpful to them. We're in a situation, sorry, I'm going to just jump back. We're in a situation with COVID where we don't know what the consequences will be. We originally hoped it would be a short V-shaped recovery, where the COVID would come through, it would just disappear, go away without too much damage. We know at the very best we're in a U-shaped environment where the COVID will stay around for a long time because vaccination will take a long time to produce, if ever, and we are required to maintain behaviors that will keep each other safe. And the longer we stay locked down, the more economic damage there will be, so we're caught between those two dilemmas. On the right, you'll see, in any case, in the world we used to work in, it was changing faster with the Industry 4.0 and many other changes than our ability to learn, I would argue, in many places. Certainly in South Africa, generally, I would say we have a learning deficit. The rate of our education is too slow. And with COVID generating that change, the gap between where we need to lift our rate of learning to where the rate of ambient changes is enormous and gathering pace. So we need to lift that gap, and the only way we can do that with good collaboration of information, intelligent thinking, and of education. Ergo, what we're doing now. In difficult times, what really matters, sorry, I'm jumping forward here on my slides. What really matters is that we innovate. So in the 2008 crisis, we would see that there were numerous situations where people were caught in a sort of sit down and let it pass trap. We're not in that situation now. We can't do it. What happened in those situations where those organizations that innovated, did R&D, put money into change, put money into developing new ways and methods, did well post the event and survived better during it. And that's what we're suggesting now, that don't hunker down, dive into this new world of virtual learning. The graph on the right is interesting. What it says is that on the top line here is the type of innovations you can do, business model all the way through to product performance down to customer experience. The green line shows where most people put most effort. So most people put most effort into innovating around performance, products, and least effort on the customer experience, or arguably, and on the business model. The research shows is that where most bang for the buck, where most return is where the blue line. So the most return is in a business model, and least return is actually in a product innovation. So when we talk about what type of innovation we do, it's a business model of what we have to do, even less than the product. And the business model is the operating model as well. And so that's why I think the shift to virtual is so important and radical to us. If we want to do well and we want to innovate well, we have to think very, very fundamentally about the way we're approaching this problem and where we need to innovate. In this sort of environment, you've got a sort of grid here. You know, you can find new markets up here, and you can keep the existing clients. You can keep your existing offering, and you can find new offerings. If we improve in the existing box here, we get improved logistics. It's like more business as usual improvements, alternative branding. So if we find new clients, well, we can switch from B2B to B2C. So we can do more direct selling of open programs, for example, or more online, okay? If we stay in our current market and find new offering, this is switching to sort of Zoom remote, a bit like what we're doing now. So you substitute your teaching from face-to-face to just doing the same thing in Zoom, or you create new products. But where the biggest opportunities are these white space opportunities and something we can call the low-touch economy. I would argue we're in a low-touch economy now where our behaviors have to be different and we're distant from each other for a year and a half, who knows? We don't know if a vaccine will come, and the only safety we really will have, unless there's some really solid treatments, and that may happen, we don't know, is if we really understand that the environment we're living in is quite different and we need to survive in this low-touch economy. How do we make those shifts? And we made the shift by shifting into virtual learning, which is this box here. We switched up to here. We maintain some of these, but we're also very deeply looking into how we can bring education into these white space opportunities. And the biggest opportunity is to get really good learning to masses of people. How do we democratize and spread learning to the people who are trapped in poverty traps, who are really, really clever? We've confused education with intelligence for far too long. Just because we're educated doesn't mean we're gifted with enormous, 1% intelligence. It's not true. We're educated. That's it. We had opportunity. Just because you're trapped, you don't have education doesn't mean you're not gifted with intelligence. You are. Most of us have more or less the same type and level of intelligence. It's training and education and opportunity that develops that and allows it to be channeled into something. So we have to get the education of the people who need it to build their lives, and those people building their lives will build our economies and reduce the Gini coefficient at the same time. So here's some useful bits of language in virtual learning. And so I'm just going to give you a little quick glossary. And so if you're teaching, if you have learning that people can access at any time, particularly online learning, you go through a paywall, something like Coursera or Get Smarter or edX, those sort of places, that we call that asynchronous learning. I'm sure you know that. Real-time learning, which is synchronous, is what we're doing now. We're talking to a group of people between us, having a debate later, in people in real time. We've all taken time out together at the same time to talk, which is the same as classic education. And when we start thinking of a taxonomy of how we start to produce products in this new world, we can differentiate between asynchronous, synchronous, and that of course we have blended and other modalities, but we need to get familiar with the language. VLEs are virtual learning environments, and they're platforms for delivery of virtual learning. And in a sense, this is one now, Moodle's another one, and there are so many Canvas, there's so many different ones available to us, and it's important to understand. LMSs are platforms for managing the back office, you could say. You know, where you put the material, the assessments, all that. They're not necessarily the same as a front office. Some do combine them, but we're finding such fast innovation now that we've got to keep fluid in presenting ourselves with these, and we're doing that all the time. By the way, what we've also had to learn is to learn many other virtual tools of virtual planning and virtual management, like Trello, Teams, and numbers of Miro, AOA, and many other ones like that. There's a difference also between accredited programs, which give you qualifications, which often take a long time to prepare, and you long time also in South Africa to accredit, sometimes 3 years, which means it's very hard for them to be just in time and to be able to keep up the pace of change. That's a real problem we have. And then credentialization, which are programs really that are giving, you know, if you suddenly into Industry 4.0, there's no certification you can get for Industry 4.0 particularly. It's a concept, it's a new world. You need to get induction into how that works. You won't have got that in your first degree because that was before Industry 4.0 happened. So you need to have short courses that bring people and make it believable that you are really good at this. And if that is credible, credentialized, then employers will give you opportunity because of it. So we need to do those short updates online. You could also say there's another one called certification, like various Microsoft tools and in the IT environment, you need those as well. Then there's contextualization, which is a bit of what we're doing now, is you're trying to make sense of a difficult new situation. Often we have to come together to share ideas, to build the language and the ideas to grapple with this new context. And that's a really important human activity and a very, very important sort of bringing very important duty, I think, of educators. And then there's congregation, and this is also partly that. You bring together people of similar interests, like we are. We're all educators or interested in education, and particularly virtual education. We all want to switch. And so we're coming together as a community of practice. So those congregation things, events, alumni events, etc., are also another thing that we found a useful way to think about working in the virtual world. I've only got a couple more slides. So we broke down what we call virtual education fluency. Now, this is something we're working on. So we are building programs on it. It's not out there in public. I'm sharing this with you now for information. It's our IP, I guess. So virtual education fluency is the designing and delivering, ensuring impact from virtual and blended learning, and it has to evolve. So at the top there, you've got this sort of 5-part Venn diagram. You've got a mastering agility, which means you need to know the platforms. You need to know how to project manage in the virtual world, which is another learning skill. You need to know how to come together with other people. You need to know how to put things into action as well, because just planning isn't good enough. And you need to be able to learn very well from action, because when you're experimenting in action, as agility often is, you're going to make mistakes. So you need to be very serious about your learning ability. And for each of those 4 things, there's a set of things you can teach. So we've got the mastery of agility at the top there. The next thing, if you're agile, you also need to know about your own organization. So senior executives, everybody, the leader of the organization and everyone throughout it, need to really get to understand what the dynamics and what the priorities are of the organization in this world. But if you go off in the wrong direction, you're just wasting everybody's time. You also need to be good at managing looking after yourself in your home office environment, because most likely we'll be working in the home office or distance office for a large part of our lives for a long time going forward. And also, I think we're finding it's more effective. We need to be committed to connect with our work teams and managers and help them make sense of things. So when we're reporting what we do, it's not just reporting upwards so they'll pat you on the back and say how well you've done. You've got to make your managers more intelligent. And to do that, you've got to give them clear summaries of the activities. Managers typically have many dots they join. If you don't give them your dots to join, then your bit will be missed out and you'll be irrelevant. So you've got to learn to make your managers more intelligent in a sort of respectful way. And finally, we need to be really good at the skills of virtual and blended education, which must be dynamic and creative, which is what we're going to talk about with Stephen and Leanne in a minute, who are both really expert. We thought we would lose in the transition all these things. We thought we would lose dialogue, intimacy, quality of education, clients, and it cost us a fortune. We find we lost a little business, but we gained a lot. We lost some money. We lost some of the close group work. We lost our conservatism and old habits, sleep, and we didn't have our facilities. But what we gained was enormous. We gained time, we gained reach, we gained interest, flexibility, innovation, all those things you see there. Clients were happy that we flexed quickly. We gained reputation because of that. We gained relationships. We worked together with people to help them solve their problems. New partners coming in all the time. We gained international reach instantly, and we gained a dynamism. And I think we gained a very strong relationship with our educators, designers, and our community of educators, because we worked together to learn together, and we found it exciting. So that is me with a sort of slightly longer than I meant to summary of this, and I'll back out now and pass it over to Steve. What we're going to have is me talking, and then Steve's going to talk. He'll probably have some questions at the end, and then Leanne will talk, maybe with a couple of questions in the middle, and at the end of that, we'll have some open Q&A. So keep those questions piling in. We'll try and answer them all. And thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, John. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I really should have waited until Mamo came back. I'm really sorry, Mamo. It's just that on this beautiful Friday, I've managed to get a virtual background working. I've done a number of these Zoom sessions over the last couple of months, and I gotta say, this is the first time that it works, and I don't have half my face, blending into the wall. So I'm super excited to share with you some of the insights and some of the learnings that we've had during this transition. So if you don't mind, let me share my screen and let's get going. So unfortunately for many of you, I was sort of looking through the names in the attendees list, and there's some really clever people there. Unfortunately, I'm the computer nerd, right? So I'm going to try not to make this too boring, but when we started doing the whole remote teaching thing, we learned quite a few very valuable skills and some really great tools that I'd love to share with you today. So if I just want to check, can everybody see my presentation? Everybody happy? Momo, is that coming up?
Yes,
clear?
we can see it, Stephen. Happy, thank you.
Good. So today we're just going to tell you about what we learned and some key things and a couple of tools, and really then show you what it all looks like. In the meanwhile, please feel free to send through your questions through the Q&A feature in the application, or you're welcome to send a message through in the chat. And sort of halfway through, or sort of towards the end of my slides, I'll take a peek in there and answer any questions you may have. So when we started doing this, the very first time we did a kind of remote teaching thing was for a student who came to me who said she's fallen pregnant and she'd love to attend class, but wouldn't be able to do so in person. And so we had a little bar stool in the lecture theatre with a laptop on it. And I'm not sure if many of you still remember Skype, but we had a guy there with Skype on a laptop, and he was sort of twisting and turning the laptop as people were asking questions and as the educator was teaching. And from those very early days to where we are today, a lot has changed. We've made things a lot more sophisticated. We scaled it up. These are the trolleys that we use at Henley to do teaching in a classroom environment, right? And as you can see, very sophisticated, super slick. We then went and we started building these things into various rooms. And so what you're looking at here is a photo of a classroom where we have a video wall at the back. And then what we've got is we've got a very special camera here at the top. And at the back of the classroom, there's another one. And the lecturer would clip on one of those lapel microphones. And as they move through the room, the cameras would follow them. And it's all very sophisticated, right? Really great quality. But as we made this more complex and more sophisticated and at a higher level of quality, I kept being brought back to, sorry, I just want to tell you about this slide. A lot of the stuff that we did came off what we call the Zoom reference design. We didn't invent these things. We're not the smartest people in the world. We simply know how to Google. And so if you're interested to build one of these really sophisticated systems, you're welcome just to scan that QR code or visit the website. I'll give you access to more resources at the end of the presentation. But there's some really clever things, right, that you can do if you have a lot of money, right? But we were able to also, with this picture in mind, make things much smaller. I always, when I see this picture, I'm reminded of that lecturer who was teaching his students how to use Microsoft Word on a blackboard. And of course, I'm sure many of you know, in South Africa, there are many schools that don't have toilets, stuff like that. So if a good educator doesn't need much, then this sort of high-tech stuff is great, but it means that we can also make it much smaller. And so in the days leading up to the lockdown, our teams went and got a whole bunch of little bits of technology and got that out to each of our facilitators at their homes, right? We made sure that each facilitator had, you know, a second monitor and a few other bits. And when the lockdown hit, we were able to take those big, complicated, teach inside the venue technology bits, and we were able to bring that to a small, intimate setting in someone's home. And people were able to teach with the same kind of sophistication that they have in those rooms from home. And so it's really easy, actually, right? Because, and I say this all the time, it's not about the technology, but it's how you apply the technology. So if you don't have a lot of money, you don't need to do those fancy things. You can do this with little bits of pieces, and it can still be really efficient and really effective. So for us, some of the key issues sit around good support. You know, most educators, right, really have their hands full just delivering the lecture and engaging with students and making sure that the learning happens, right? And so to tax them with additional tech things and around, you know, the internet's not working. And we saw that in the days of our bar stool teaching, right? That, you know, in the morning, now you can't get the Skype address, and then you got to find it, and then you got to click the button, and then they have to accept, and you have to accept. I'm sure many of you have had these frustrations, right? And so when you want to deliver a good lecture, you can't be messing about with the tech. So what our teams have done is, in the days leading up to the lecture, we make sure that we reach out to every facilitator and we do a tech check with them. We make sure that all their bits work and that they know how to share their screen. We do a sound check to see that it's not too loud and not too soft, and that the picture is reasonably okay. And then during that time, we make them comfortable with the application, right? And so on the morning of the lecture, then we have our tech guy there and we say, all right, cool. So let's just test these things again, and let's just run through it another time. Because of course, you know, things break overnight. More so, we also do the same thing with our students. So when the students start walking into the virtual classroom, right, we do a little interaction with them, a little exercise. We ask them to mute and unmute their microphones. We make sure that they know how to share their screen, you know, and we go through a little bit of housekeeping, right? And we do it in a fun way, you know. It's that sort of, good morning, how you doing? What's happening? Tell us your favorite color in the chat. And through this sort of playful interaction and welcome, we're able to make sure that all the students are also familiar and comfortable with the technology. Because, you know, there's nothing so frightful for somebody who's never done this before, right? And so daunting. And now you need to lecture, and it's just, you know, so good technical support, really important. And then after the lecture, we also make sure that that our operators do things like, you know, trim the videos, get them out to the students. And so having great support for your educators and your learners is super key during this virtual transition. Additionally, there's also a couple of bits of hardware. Now, you can make this really sophisticated, or you can make it, you can do it on the back of a matchbox, right? It doesn't really matter. But we found that most educators need some kind of whiteboard, right? Even when they're teaching under a tree, and that, where's that slide, right? They had the blackboard right there, right? And so, as many of you know, the sort of whiteboard features in Zoom or in these online things are not great. I mean, I'm sure many of you try to sign your signature with your mouse. It's a rubbish experience. So getting a good whiteboard derivative or alternative is super important. And sometimes it's just having, quite literally, sort of behind you over here, a flip chart, right? Just make sure that your camera is good enough that students can see it, and that's okay. We've done a lot of great work with Apple iPads, if you have that you know, in your budget. And so with an Apple iPad, you can share a screen. And there's some really great tools like Miro that allow you to collaborate on your iPad with the class. And so that makes for a really good sort of whiteboard experience. The second thing that we think is really important is having dual monitors. Now, by the way, right now I don't have a dual monitor. So I'm looking at my slide and I actually can't see what's going on. In fact, that's probably the reason why I jumped in front of Momo and cut her off before she could start, because I didn't know she was going to appear. So dual monitors are really key. This is especially important if you want to see your entire class. If you want to have that connection, that deep connection with the students. You know, people will often tell you that, yeah, it's not the same teaching through an online feature, right? It's not the same teaching through Zoom or through Microsoft Teams or these sorts of things, right? Because you don't have that deep connection with a student. But let me tell you, you also don't have that deep connection with your class when you're teaching in a physical space with the guys at the very back, or the oaks who've got their laptop screens up. With a dual monitor and with people's cameras on, you can see your students and you can look them in the eye and you can have a really meaningful connection, right? It's sometimes a problem when people have poor internet and you can't, you know, and they don't all turn their cameras on, or that there's issues around that. But we'll chat about that in a moment some more. The other thing that we think is really important is to have a good microphone and a good webcam. You know, there's nothing more frustrating when the picture is all blurry and you can't hear properly and you can't see properly. And so we always ask our teams to check that these things are ready and good ahead of time. And then, of course, I'm sure you can imagine having good internet is really important. And sometimes the internet does break, even if you have fiber, even if you've got the best connection in the world. And so there's an important part here in terms of program design and what to do for those eventualities. But I'll tell you more about that in a second. The other thing that I think is really important is to have a good, we call it real-time platform, to have a good delivery platform. Now, you know, we've standardized on Zoom. But like I said before, it's not about the technology. It's not about what software you use. We've had some success with Microsoft Teams. We've had some success with BlueJeans, and there's very many other products out there that we use. Some of our clients have had real concerns around the security in Zoom. And so we've needed to be flexible and to be agile and to adapt to our clients' needs. And many of our corporate clients have standardized on Microsoft Teams. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but Microsoft Teams, for instance, doesn't have breakaway rooms. And that's sort of key for some of our learnings. So our teams will just improvise. They'll make sort of fake breakaway rooms by creating many more meetings and things like that. So this is about looking at the tool and seeing how best you can apply it. And there's some really great ones. You know, Zoom has had some real security concerns. By the way, much of that has turned out to be fake news. There was a lovely article I read the other day that said, you know, the big data breach that everybody talks about, you know, 50 million, or I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of Zoom accounts were leaked on the dark web. Turns out those accounts didn't come from Zoom. Zoom was never compromised in that case. In fact, what somebody had done was they'd bought a list of usernames and passwords that were compromised off another site. And they'd very cleverly tried to log on to Zoom with those username and passwords. And I know many of you out there reuse your same username and password across multiple services. Naughty, naughty, don't do that. And that is how they found this whole treasure trove of Zoom accounts. They weren't Zoom accounts, they were accounts off another service. But of course, it creates bad publicity, right? And when your clients are saying, we're not going to use that tool, you need to adapt. So, you know, Microsoft Teams is a strong contender because in the education space, Microsoft makes Microsoft Teams and a lot of their licensing available for free or at a great discount to educational institutions. So if you have budget constraints, that's definitely something to look at. BlueJeans is a very good third platform. Uses less bandwidth than Teams and Zoom, but is still, you know, sort of in development and growing. Google Meets, which is part of the Google Classroom platform, really good, great tool. Just unfortunately, you can't see so many students at the same time. And Jitsi, which is based on Google Meets, is a totally free, very lightweight, very easy to use platform, right? There's also WebEx. WebEx is you know, the old granddaddy in this space. Has been around for a long time and is part of Cisco. It comes at a bit of a price, but is a really rock solid contender. So have a look at those. These are good tools. And then also, as you've seen over the last couple of months, Zoom have done some incredible work in their security. And so I see there's kind of like a resurgence in popularity for them. So look at these tools and see how best to apply them within your organization. But not only the teaching tools, not only the delivery platform, there's some really great things that educators can do during their program design, and this is something that Leanne is absolute whiz with, and I'll let her speak to them, right? But there's so many great online tools that you as educators can use to make the experience for your students so much better, especially when there are bandwidth issues, when there are other challenges. So one of the tools I really enjoy using, because I think it's fun, is a tool called Kahoot. What Kahoot does is it's like a game show tool, right? So you can ask your students a question, and there's like some music that plays and flashing lights, and they're going to pick A, B, C, or D. I'm sure many of you know the old thing that teachers used to do at school. You know, that sort of walk down the passage and that go, "So Johnny, 1 + 1 is," and then there'd be that sort of long pause as the educator wants Johnny to think about the answer, right? So you can't really do something like that in Zoom. It doesn't really work so well. It's, you know, there's just everybody screaming at the same time, and it's noisy and distracting. But a tool like Kahoot is a really good replacement for that, right? So Creative is another great tool if your students have the ability to use what we call a second screen. So in other words, they've got maybe a mobile phone or an iPad or a second device. You as an educator can set up an additional quiz. So you're showing a PowerPoint presentation through Zoom, for instance, and then suddenly on their mobile phone a quiz pops up, or a little infographic, or some more information. And so using different tools, you're really able to spread the bandwidth. So firstly, it's not all going through the Zoom channel. So when students have their screens off, you can still have a deep, meaningful engagement with them, right? But also it makes the learning experience so much richer. Just on the other side here, I've got a picture of the logo of Animoto. You know, as educators, none of us are really great in, you know, doing video production and clever things like that. We don't have the time, we don't have the energy. But Animoto is a really good tool just to quickly throw a little video together. A couple of pictures, a little bit of music. It's point and click, it's 2-3 seconds, and you can have some really powerful messaging and really strong idea sharing through a tool like that. And then, of course, there's some really clever built-in features within the platform itself. So like Zoom, for instance, I'm not sure many people know this, but there's some great breakaway room features, the Q&As, the quizzes, the polling. There's quite a lot that you can just use natively within the application, right? And then last but not least, you can make this really low touch, really low key. Tools like WhatsApp are phenomenal, right? When you can't share your video, when you can't engage with the class, there's nothing like saying, hey, send me a voice note or a short little video that you put together in WhatsApp to create that kind of engagement with your class. So use these tools and use them in conjunction with the teaching platform, and you can create a really rich experience. I want to quickly show you what the system looks like. So in here, and if I move to the next slide, this is just one of the classes. In fact, this is one of Leanne's classes. Leanne, I hope you don't mind me sharing this. But this is Leanne's class, and you'll see as the camera pans to the left of the machine, you'll actually see our operator sitting there, and you can see the key role that the operator plays during the session. So here we go.
1, 2, go.
There we go. What a wonderful video, and what a wonderful experience. And so I'm sure many of you have lots of questions. You're more than welcome to post them to us in the Q&A feature or in the chat. I'll have a look at them in just a second. But you're also welcome to visit our Build 2020 website. If you register on that, Mama will give you access. And a lot of the stuff that we speak about here today will be available for you to download there. So thank you so much. And let me take a quick squiz through the questions. How do you successfully bridge learning programs, root and social? Does it even create it? Okay. That's not a question for me. I will bow out and let the people who know more about these things answer. Let me see in the chat, is there anything in there? So Rian was saying about something that we was doing with a radio show with their phones. I mean, it's amazing that you can do with such low, low tech tools, but it can have such a high impact. So, so thanks, Rian. What a lovely share. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Anybody else? Leanne, have I missed anybody?
Stephen, you haven't missed anybody, but I think John may want to comment on one of the questions. John?
Well, I can comment on both if you like. So,
Thanks.
Bob. Hi, Bob. Bonjour. Comment ça va en France? Lovely to see you. I know you can't answer, so you can't comment on my accent. Yeah, the Master of Agility is a separate model, which I'll show you later. It could be at the center, but I wanted to have a Venn diagram, so it showed tensions rather than a centricity. It was just the way I thought of putting it together. The second one, how do you successfully build learning programs, notes rooted in social structure-based pedagogical framework into a virtual learning environment? And is it even possible? Yes, it is. I mean, a lot of our stuff is sort of, all knowledge is gossip, social constructivist sort of perspective on things. And I think that's what we do anyway. We're not teaching content very often, but we're often teaching interpretation. And so it's all critical thinking and that sort of worldview. So you can do it very effectively if you don't think that virtual teaching is about teaching. It's a flipped classroom, and Leanne will talk about all this, where you do the interpretation. You've got to be clever with the tools. Does it create a case for mentorship coupled with industry-related events out of the VLE? Absolutely. That's just one of the sort of many things you could do once you engage your imaginative node in the brain, which is often turned off in education too much in some of these things. So, just let those imaginations flow and just get inventing. So I would say, yes, yes. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John. Over to you, Leanne.
Thanks so much, Mamo. I figured you were on mute, so I just intervened. I'm just going to share my screen, and while I'm doing that, just do a brief introduction. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on your Friday afternoon. Hopefully this is a different Friday afternoon, as you've been able to stock up on alcohol supplies. So I'm looking forward to raising a glass with you at the end of this session. My name's Leanne Naidu, and I am a faculty member at Henley Business School. And I wanted to share with you a few things today that I hope will help you get a feel for how we transitioned very quickly to delivering virtual classrooms, ultimately to provide organizations with sustainable business value. Before I do that, though, I'm going to ask the tech team to launch my first poll. And you're going to see a screen pop up very shortly. And that screen, hopefully you can see my screen shared with you now. But you're going to see a poll ask you a simple question around how ready are you to transition to virtual learning and online classrooms. If you wouldn't mind just taking a few seconds to do that, I can then share my screen with you. Thank you. I see some of you responding already. I see many of you have already made some very good progress in transitioning your offerings and your approach to virtual and online learning. I'll come back to the poll in a few moments, but please feel free to record your responses and I'll incorporate that into my talk shortly. So you should also now be seeing my screen. Just by virtue of introduction, I am a management consultant by profession. I've been involved in leadership development and learning, though, for more than half of that 25-year-long career. And I started in the virtual learning and online learning space 12 years ago. Today, I want to share with you in a quite humorous way some of the mistakes we made 12 years ago that certainly helped us transition very quickly at Henley Business School this year in particular to virtual learning. So the three things that I really want to cover off with you is about evolving learning frameworks. So how do you actually make that shift? I'm going to spend a proportional amount of time on it based on the poll. So for those of you that need more information, I'll spend a bit of time on it. But I think what I'm seeing from the poll already So many of you have already made that transition, and you're perhaps looking at evolving that to something even better. So I'm going to focus on what we call digital pedagogies and what learning in the new normal needs to include, both from a facilitator or institution perspective, as well as from a student perspective. And finally, how to have some fun during this time, because it can get quite boring looking at a screen all the time, all day, and now having to deliver learning through it as well. So that's kind of the frame for the next 20 minutes or so that I have with you. So fasten your seatbelts and let's get going. Feel free to laugh along with me on my first slide as I share with you some of the mistakes that I made 12 years ago when I was first introduced to digital technologies, virtual learning, e-learning solutions, and other such platforms. The first thing we thought we were doing very well is simply converting face-to-face online classroom-based content to a webinar, and we thought we had gone virtual. Big mistake there. That's not how you transition to virtual. The second thing we did is we actually added in pre-recorded videos, and we thought we were being fancy. Imagine that. Very scary stuff. The next thing we did that we thought we were doing brilliantly well, thinking about the user accessing learning on screen, is we made the font larger. Can you imagine? And then we assumed time was equal. So for an 8-hour-long training course, we thought we needed to deliver an 8-hour-long virtual classroom. No, big mistake. That does not work well that way. The other thing that we did is we spent a lot of money on Stephen's technology. So fortunately, we have Stephen on board and he does it in a very cost-effective way. But 12 years ago, I didn't know Stephen. And so we spent a whole lot of money on fancy kit. And of course, we needed to prove the ROI on it. And so we needed to add more delegates to the classroom to be able to substantiate ROI. That doesn't make learning more effective. We talked at our delegates, sometimes speaking louder, sometimes opening our mouths wider, as if that would make a difference to the delivery. Really patronizing. And if you're doing any of those things, or you're thinking about doing any of those things, or you're coming across people that are doing those things, have a good laugh, but please help them along the journey as well, because it's the end user and the delegate experience that we don't want to compromise. So I hope you had a very good laugh at my expense on this Friday afternoon. Let's move on to the serious stuff. Now we know, by virtue of being educators, coaches, facilitators, which is what I can see from the chat today, we know and are cognizant of memorability of learning. So I'm not going to patronize you by telling you what we need to focus on, but rather to think about looking at it from a delivery perspective and delivering through online learning. So if you were to consider, and this is what one of the first things we had to consider from a Henley Business School perspective when we transitioned very quickly in March, we took the face-to-face content, we had to look at the learning outcomes that we were trying to deliver, and we had to look at the blend of learning interventions that we had built into a traditional classroom-based environment, and we had to rethink the model entirely. Because whereas when you're face-to-face and you're interacting with the class and you have peripheral vision that you're able to engage the class with, it's easy actually to spot and to use verbal cues and to use graphics and to demonstrate relatively easily. But when you're demonstrating, so that would be the middle section of the slide, when you're demonstrating on screen, that level of interactivity and that level of engagement is somewhat lost. If you're thinking about how to make learning memorable, and you're thinking about how to simulate that activity and how to get participants to be involved, actively engaged in the activity, how do you do that if they're not clustered around a desk? So rethinking your design, which is what Stephen mentioned earlier, rethinking the design around what participation actually means to make that learning module memorable is going to be key. And I'm going to show you how in a moment. Traditionally, we've been exposed to multiple intelligences. For many of us, and I'm going to speak for myself, I was primarily exposed to a logical, mathematical, and verbal linguistic form of education. And it was that type of intelligence that I had been through school and university and tertiary education as well. Now, I know that you would be familiar of the 8 different intelligence types. But again, one of the things we had to factor into the design of our programs at Henley to make it more engaging is to ensure that we recognize different intelligence types in a virtual learning delivery style. So what that means is when we're engaging with people from their lounges or their offices and studies, sometimes from their cars, because their households were really full and really noisy, sometimes their garages as well. Some of them were even driving to shopping malls to be able to park in a car park, to be able to access it. Then how do we achieve that level of participation and engagement, recognizing that some people want to be out in nature, some people need stronger visual cues, some people need to be more physically active in their engagement, some people needed a mix of it. And by virtue of looking at multiple intelligences, let's not forget that learning styles is different to multiple intelligences in that we have to engage visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and reading and writing capabilities. Now, I am primarily an auditory learner. Together with any visual cues, my memorability is enhanced exponentially. Now, for those of us that are looking at delivering training, primarily through reading and writing, or primarily through a virtual delivery platform like Zoom, how then do we bring in the kinesthetic elements of learning? How else do we bring visual into it without just simply projecting something as a picture in PowerPoint? So how can we be a little bit more creative in this? And this is something that we spent a lot of time and attention on as program directors, as designers of learning interventions with our faculty who were less au fait with delivering training online. The other thing that we needed to recognize is that virtual learning is not e-learning. So the key thing we were transitioning from and to is primarily face-to-face, even though there were many other activities and resources that our students could access. We weren't moving to static online learning, i.e. e-learning. It needed to be a blend. So as you think about some of the subjects that you teach, the institutions that you're from, the complexity of the content that you're trying to teach, I want to encourage you to think about what is the blend in the approach, but try to think about the blend, because I know you're delivering blended learning already by virtue of primarily a classroom-based environment. Flip it. What does the blend now need to be when the majority of how you're delivering it is already on screen? How do you make it more tactile? How do you make it more physically active? How do you actually, and here's the irony, how do you actually minimize learning on screen time? Wouldn't that be interesting to think about? So at this point, I'm going to pause and I'm going to ask for the results of the poll to be put up. And for those of you that can see it, I'm now sharing the poll and just get a feel for where everyone is at so that I know how to structure the remaining time I have with you today. So I see that a very small proportion haven't started or have just started and you're struggling, but the majority of you are in the space of have started and making good progress, and you're doing really well in this space, and you're here to explore more. Fantastic. For those of you that have started and have learned lessons from it, please do share on the Q&A, on the chat as well. This is really an open forum and we're just sharing our experiences. We'd love for you to share your experiences too. So thanks, folks. It's a really good result to see. So as I move through this, I want to just remind you of the context in which we're delivering this learning. Let's talk about this new normal. COVID aside, we're breaching and redefining what this needs to look like. And so what is this new normal that we're trying to deliver training in? Let's not forget that work is done on screen. So people are working remotely from their lounges, from their offices at home, amongst kids and dogs barking. You can hear mine in the background probably, and a whole busy kind of network. So work is done on screen. Guess what? Socializing is done on screen. Entertainment is also done on screen. Hobbies like reading and drawing are now done on screen, and we don't have the benefit of engaging outside. Sports, oh my goodness, also done on screen. Playing music now being evolved to being done more on screen. And here we come along as educators, as facilitators and coaches, and guess what? We're expecting our delegates to be very excited to see yet another thing on screen. And so we've got to be cognizant of how we design and recognizing that a lot of time is being spent on screen. What is the best way to impart learning, how to make it memorable, how to ensure that the experience of it is a pleasant one, and that for some of my students, for example, who need to come in for various blocks during the course of a year, that they actually look forward to the intervention rather than see it as more of the same. So I want to move us deeper into what must learning look like and what we needed to consider from a Henley Business School perspective. Again, we're very familiar with pedagogies and andragogies. We know that pedagogies are around education for children, andragogies, how do we design education and learning experiences for adults? We've got to think about the maturity of the learner, the student's motivation for learning, children primarily external forces for motivation, parents, and of course you've got to get a good education from a good school and be the best that you possibly can. And with adults, it might be career driven, it might be ambition oriented. And so we looked at pedagogies and andragogies. That wasn't enough, folks. What we needed to consider was the concept of heutagogies. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the term. Let me know whether you're familiar with the term on the chat, so I'll know how much detail to go into it for the rest of the conversation. But heutagogies are primarily currently, but not limited to, looking at adult learners who are accessing learning, not from a career perspective, but from an interest perspective. So what that means is there might be no need for accreditation. There might be no need or no extrinsic value or motivator that's driving this, but rather just personal interest, perhaps a passion, perhaps wanting to start something new, do something in their communities, and understanding the key principle of heutagogy, which is motivation, is going to be key to how you design going forward, and was instrumental to looking at how we designed. So we had to link the heutagogical principles of motivation. The role of the learner in the experience fundamentally changed. So we needed to broker a partnership in this learning experience. So there wasn't the sage on stage approach, not that there was initially, but we needed to shift it even further. And we needed to drive accountability for learning from the audience themselves. And so it became a co-creation of a learning experience. As a business school, as a learning institution, we had to be very cognizant of the accreditation standards, the unit standards, and we needed to be compliant with those things. But at the same time, we had to create a virtual learning environment that was conducive to very memorable and impactful learning experiences while still being compliant. So heutagogy and those principles played a very big role in our design. The other thing that we had to consider around Bloom's taxonomy, we know Bloom's taxonomy traditionally looking at what are we imparting in terms of learning in the classroom and outside of the classroom. And typically what we would do is we would introduce a concept or a learning module inside of the classroom first, and then we would have delegates apply the learning outside the classroom in a traditional model. What we're now talking about by virtue of flipping the model is we get the delegates to do the pre-work in advance, to really grasp key concepts in advance, and we use the value of having them together online, in breakout rooms, in plenary, virtually online, to really apply higher order thinking skills. So for them to apply the learning, to analyze it, to debate, to criticize, to deconstruct, to evaluate, and ultimately, depending on the level of the program, to create something new from having integrated the learning on a very deep level. This fundamentally changes the design and the focus of how training is delivered, when it's delivered, and where it's delivered. And the onus of responsibility then also shifts far more significantly to the learner to grasp the key learning in advance. Digital pedagogies, I'm going to flesh this out for you now. I'm going to pause just before I go into the detail of this, and I'm going to ask Stephen and Mamo just to spot any questions that might be appropriate for me to answer at this point. But the digital pedagogy that I want to go into now for a few moments is to get you to think about some of the macro level design considerations and share with you what we've done at Henley, and also think about some of the micro level design considerations that you may want to factor into your particular courses. I'm going to pause there and just ask my colleagues to see if they've spotted any questions that have come up.
Nothing at this stage, Leanne.
Okay, thanks, Mamo. I'm going to run through it then. Thank you. So when we talk about macro and micro level designs, consider this picture. If there's one thing you take away from my presentation today, is this picture. This picture talks about a flipped classroom, which isn't news, I know, but I want you to think about it from 5 dimensions. Think about what happens in class versus out of class, and think about what happens before, during, and after class. And if you are able to take your module or your program and deconstruct it in this way, you will pretty much have a better and clearer understanding of how you need to deliver your course content in the time that you've got available to the delegates that you have as your students. What do I mean by macro level? Let's take macro and micro in turn. Macro is exactly as you know it. For those of you that are very technical learning designers, please don't criticize me for using such a blasé term. When I talk macro, I'm just talking about the high level view of what is the course goal, what are the objectives, how are you going to assess learning, what are some of the teaching strategies you're going to use, and what are some of the tools, particularly online and virtual tools and resources you're going to use. Please, folks, I raise this not in the context of you doing more of the same that you used to do from a traditionally face-to-face learning environment, but for you to think about how do you need to change these elements of it? Where must the focus be now that you're delivering it virtually? Should the focus change? In what respect should it change? Will the goal stay the same? Will the objectives stay the same? But might the teaching strategy change? Might the way in which you do assessments change? Might your mix of tools that you use change? And only you can answer it. These are the prompts to help you think that through. On a micro level, there's 3 things I want to share with you. The first is around the learner experience to, first of all, content, second of all, the facilitator, third of all, with each other. Remember, learning is a social experience as well. So when we talk about learner to content, what is your content looking like? So if they are doing pre-reading in advance, what does your content look like? How engaging is it? Is it more reading stuff? Is it heavy? Can they listen to something? Is there a quick video that they can watch? How do you do introductions in class? How do you create the connection? And connection is one of the key things. Connection as well to the second point around your facilitator. What is that connection looking like? Is your facilitator feeling really stressed about looking at the technology, looking at the Q&A, wondering whether the screen is being shared, wondering what the poll is looking like, etc.? Or is the facilitator really truly connecting with the audience? So how do we make the content as a facilitator secondary to the connection that we are making with delegates? Finally, learner-to-learner experience. Now, with a platform like Zoom, which is really good in terms of interactivity, having breakout rooms, doing it really easily as well. And as a facilitator, you're being able to pop into breakout rooms rather than just leaving students to their own devices. You know, you can co-facilitate those sessions. So finding the right platform and then designing your content with your platform in mind is always going to be helpful. And then thinking about what your interaction is going to be like with your students on that platform. 2 things that I want to share with you on assessments. Why are you assessing? Key question. Sometimes we've assessed because that's what we've always done and we just keep doing more of the same. Ask yourself the tough question. Why are you assessing? What are you assessing? Who and how are you going to assess given the virtual environment? How does the way in which you're going to assess bring validity and reliability of that particular assessment or that module or the manner in which the student is engaging with it? A way to really dive deeper into this is for you to consider Bloom's taxonomy and then to think about what are some of the online assessment methods that you can use. One of the things we've had to think about carefully and we had to plan very stringently was how examinations were administered on our accredited programs at Henley. How does invigilation work if people aren't face-to-face? What happens with an open book case study? Does it matter that students are copying and pasting their own notes into an exam answer book? Does it matter? Obviously it does if they're copying off of Google. And what does that mean in terms of plagiarism declarations? These are some of the considerations that you may be interested in exploring further. And if anybody has any interest in that, I'm happy to share the answers to your questions in that regard. But just think hard. Why are you assessing? What are you assessing that would make it reliable and valid in terms of your assessment methods? Who is going to execute on that assessment? And how will you ensure, again, that it's valid and reliable? Because that's going to be key, and it's going to be, for those of you that are involved in accredited programs, that's going to be one of the compliance and audit criteria that you'd need to, hand on heart, be sure that you are able to execute on. Think about during the session. So as we talked about preparing before and how you're designing your assessments, let's talk about during the session. We've got to think about, if we are delivering live, that the session is very likely going to be recorded. And when it is recorded, how might that session play out in an asynchronous way? So by that, what I mean is, if you have a student that isn't able to join live and has missed out on the interactivity and the breakout group, because not all breakout groups can be recorded, how do they then catch up? And how is their learning experience not adversely impacted in any way? So when you think about designing and you think about what the day looks like, think about, what does this feel like from a live interactive perspective and an asynchronous perspective? I spoke about objectives and structure, but perhaps a guideline for you around how to break down an hour, and you decide based on the length of your module delivery what would be an appropriate breakdown. But typically what we found worked well is, if we're applying the flipped classroom perspective, where there's some pre-work that students have to do, then the first 20 minutes of an hour-long module would typically be a joint facilitator and students recapping content, with perhaps students asking for clarification from the facilitators to what might this module mean, where they may not be clear. The second 20 minutes will be engaged in integration of learning, adapting learning, problem solving, discussion of students. And the facilitator would pop in and out to be able to facilitate that conversation and again clarify, but it's done in smaller groups. 10 minutes, so you're on your post 40 minutes now. So in your next 10 minutes, you would probably be looking for feedback, reflections, perhaps some note taking, some referencing, some idea sharing. And in your last 10 minutes, please do not underestimate the value of a body break and a break away from the screen. So a physical break away from the screen. Because remember, in the 10 minutes before that, the feedback and reflections are also done on screen. So what you want people to do is to physically move away from the screen and just think about something else. Look at a different medium of note-taking or reflecting, or even just having a good old stretch. Because you're delivering on screen, again, think about, and I said this earlier, think about the mix of slideware versus videos versus sound clips, group work. One of the key things that I find works really well is gamification. So how might you gamify certain aspects of the learning such that there is value in and fun in the learning and students actually feel it? Think about when you are to break down using this guideline or something similar to that, what do we mean by bite-sized chunks? Is a bite-sized chunk part of the critical path or the critical outcome that you're trying to achieve from that particular learning intervention? I'm not going to go through the detail of this slide, but I just want to pick up on point number 8, which is, don't just deliver training sitting down, it kills the energy. So what I tend to do is I tend to mix it up. I'm not mixing it up with you today because it's a short segment, but where I'm delivering a day-long course, I mix it up, but I mix it up in a way that is what I call neat. So in other words, I'm not pacing up and down such that I feel like a pendulum on the screen and I'm making my students fall asleep. There will be a segment where I will design the course for me to be standing, working with perhaps a flip chart or a whiteboard. There'll be another key segment where I might be working with sharing my iPad as a whiteboard. There might be another element where I'm perched on a bar stool. There might be an aspect that I might be in the garden, even interacting with them as I do a reflective exercise, and I may even ask my students to join me in their gardens if possible too, or at least close to some natural light. Changing the scenery and changing the movement is key. The reason why I'm spending a minute and a half on this particular point is that it speaks to one of the key pitfalls of delivering through online learning, which is something that we call Zoom gloom. It's not limited to Zoom, it's relevant to all virtual learning platforms. It's where you get to see head and shoulders of somebody all the time. And when you get to see that every day for 5 days, probably 8 meetings in a day or more, plus you then have to expose your students to that as a facilitator, it feels really boring. So you probably want to change that up. And don't forget that 55% of learning and communication in particular is obtained from physical gestures and body language, and and most of that comes from below head and shoulders, because we're using hand gestures and physical body movements, and our posture together with the activity levels that we bring in just by virtue of our body movements also enhance the learning. And so that's something you've got to think about. And where you are physically standing up, generally the space between you and your laptop is greater. So it's usually about 1 meter away, which means the sound quality is not good. So you've just got to factor that in, as Stephen said, with the tech that he was talking about. Just factor in if you are moving about, if you are looking away, and where is your speaker in relation to your camera screen, and just think about how you're going to deliver that to ensure that no one is lost by virtue of delivering online. Just a few more slides, and I know we're good for time. So I'd like for you to also think about, and this is one of our key learnings, about what after the session looks like. So remember, one of the big mistakes that I made early on in my career is assuming that time was equal. So time's not equal. What I tend to do now is I design my day against the delegates. So what that means is they define the time they want to start. They define the time that they want to finish, and we have that agreement established up front per organization, per client, per program. And what we try to do with that is to design in accordance with that time. So for example, next week, I'm running a program for the whole week with a banking client, and these bankers are working from home now. And we now need to look at how do we help them accommodate the requirements of the program, which includes an exam next week, together with a very interactive module, which ordinarily would have them literally physically sitting on the floor and building Lego and constructing physical things in groups. So what does that mean for how we're going to deliver that next week? And in so doing, and in order to make it impactful, one of the things we've decided to do is shorten the week. So in other words, finish class time earlier and give them enough time for them to prepare for the next day. So this is where this slide plays in. Your after the session actually also implies before the session, because after the session is about integrating and really understanding what was taught during the day. But there's also an element of time that you've got to factor in for them to then prepare for the next day. Don't forget, in between, they still have to take care of the kids. They still have to prepare dinner. There's still bills to be paid and spouses to be taken care of, and shopping to be done as well. So all of those things need to be factored in. How then do you structure the day in order for your time after the session to be legitimate and used wisely? So that's kind of the structure, you know, the 5 bubbles that I wanted to share with you. There's just 3 more things I want to flag that we learned in the most recent transition that we did at Henley. One is assisting your students with the transition. Do not underestimate it. Just because you've become a pro at it, do not assume that your students are going to make that transition as quickly as you. Also, if you, like me, are working with other faculty members, in as much as they might be brilliant and specialists and expert at what they do, delivering it through a different media requires time, it requires thought. And the shock factor, the tech factor, the scary factor, the what if factor needs to be removed from it, and that takes time. So one of the things we've done, and we continue to do it, even though we've gotten good at it, our students are still new at it, and every program that we run is the same. So it doesn't matter whether I have 5 programs from, say, 5 different banks for simplicity, and just because it goes well for 3 of the banks doesn't mean it's going to go well for the other 2. And the reason for that is because each person's connectivity is different from home. The types of laptops that they use are different. The firewalls preclude certain interactivity. So take the time, do the test run, as Stephen said, do the tech test, as he called it, but also hold their hands, because when they've got to do an assessment, through a technology-based application when it's an exam and all of the psychology and all the fear of an exam, all the distractions in life going on, take the time. And what I tend to find works well is rather than just and only emails and broadcast emails and WhatsApp messages, I take the time to connect with each person individually on my program. It used to be really easy when it's face-to-face, right? Because then you've got the morning before class starts, you get to sidle over to somebody on a coffee break, you get to spend a coffee break with a few people on an individual basis, but you don't have the value of that when you're delivering it through tech, and then you're relying on that same quality of relationship to start, blossom, grow, develop, evolve, and for that closeness to be there. And it can't be there. It can't be there unless you give it the one-on-one time. So understand the psychological impact. Also, don't assume that just because somebody is happy and smiling that everything's okay. There are many students that are struggling and struggling from different capacities. I talked about students of mine that have driven to a shopping mall to be able to get better internet access. Other students that have driven somewhere else because of a power failure. Students that have had data issues, they've underestimated the data load on being able to connect and download content. Students are struggling for a variety of reasons. Not all of them are going to admit to you, and certainly not in a public forum. So please be cognizant of that and take the time up front. It's going to make it a lot smoother as you get into the delivery of it. They're going to feel better connected to you as well. And it's going to make the experience a positive one. So I know I didn't go through all of the points in the slide, but I just wanted to flag a few. And I know that Mama is going to share these slides with you separately through our Build website as well. I mentioned Zoom gloom earlier, and I talked about the nonverbal cues being lost because you're only seeing head and shoulders shots and you're not seeing the full extent of the gestures, which is what animates the conversation, but also to introduce you to the concept of emotional contagion, which is generally conveyed through not just verbal cues and facial cues, but gestures and physical body movements as well. So the energy that you're giving off needs to almost be exaggerated somewhat, but remember, sometimes the connectivity is not very good. So those subtle gestures as well are missed online. And so you've got to think about how to become more collaborative. So I'm not asking for you to become a jester, to make more physical movements, to be more entertaining. That's going to be much more exhausting for you and very exhausting on the eye and the minds of your students that are watching you. They're just to think about how might you mix your approach to your blended learning design in a way that keeps them engaged and that Zoom gloom doesn't set in, particularly Wednesday afternoon, Thursday, we start feeling it. So also think about how you're structuring your week and how you're mixing it up and how much of outside time you can actually build in. I also want you to think about some of the aspects that you might consider. And it's really interesting, and I'd love to get your views, is there are mixed views out there around limiting video calls. So what happens if you suddenly implement shutting down video? Is that a good thing? Is that not a good thing? Under what circumstances might limiting video connectivity be a good thing? Because then you're primarily relying on audio and auditory sensory learning. If people are turning on the camera, have you established ground rules? I mean, have you seen how people are dressing for online learning these days? It's amazing. So clearly the fashion sense changes face-to-face when we're online as well. So the reason why I want you to think about this is, in addition to making learning and delivering it through an online platform, making it enjoyable, there are also some elements around how you're energizing the learner, but what are some of the boundaries and buffers that you need to put in place to get people to engage, given that so much is being done on screen these days. So folks, I've come to the end of my presentation and I'm going to look at the Q&A in a few minutes, but just to summarize all that I've spoken about today in a slightly different way. First point, get the administration of online programs done quickly, in advance, get it right. do the tests, make sure that the administration of your virtual learning platform is done meticulously well in advance. Second point, when you're thinking about blended learning programs, don't just think blended learning is slideware, videos, and breakout groups. There's more to blended learning when you are delivering it from a virtual platform than you might have thought of before. Stephen mentioned WhatsApp functionality. There are many other social media platforms that can be used, as well as other interactions that can be built into your program to make it more impactful. Stretch yourself. This is an opportunity for you to think about how to redesign your learning, but also how to reinvent yourself to be relevant, to be leading edge, and to be memorable, because that's really what learning is about, right? Memorability. Third point, when you're looking at your course design and you're using perhaps the flipped classroom basis, don't just think about how you're designing as you've always done. Think about the 5 dimensions: in class and out class, pre, during, and after. And based on that, point number 4 around the orange little pie, piece of pie here, is when you're thinking about the quality of your teaching and your instructional practice. So in other words, how are you going to do your assessments? And to the second last point, your digital courseware for your instructional practice. How are you going to monitor, record, evaluate with reliability and validity? Just think about how your instructional practice plays out such that you set up your students well for when they are going to be assessed. Finally, online student support doesn't come at the end, it comes all the way through. In fact, if I had to redraw this diagram, this would be at the fundamental center of this particular picture. So I hope this has proved to be a good summary of what I talked through this segment today. Finally, don't forget, when it comes to how you're going to have fun while making an impact, well, that's up to you and your personality type. So for those of you that want to take it to huge extremes, please experiment, play. My classes sing happy birthday. The sound quality on my side wasn't good with the video Stephen showed, but you know, we celebrate birthdays, we do Mexican waves, we use people's environments really well as well. So next week for my class, for example, we're going to have a few people doing cooking lessons with us. We're going to have a few people choosing artifacts from their homes and sharing their personal stories with us. We're going to have family members joining us and providing feedback and just fun stuff. We're going to monopolize this opportunity. And in doing so, it strengthens the connection. And when you strengthen the connection, you strengthen the learning. So I hope you found that useful today. I'm going to ask the IT team to launch my last poll with you now. And as that poll is launched, which is to ask, do you still need any additional support? It's always helpful for us to know whether you might need some additional support. Please do let me know. I'm going to ask my colleagues as well to monitor the Q&A and the chat for me, just to see if there's any specific questions that you have for my team and I. It's not just specifically for me. And I'd love to just also get your feedback and stay in touch with you. And this is the Build website that we were talking about that you can contact us on. I can see approximately 13 people have responded to the poll so far. As soon as we get more respondents coming through, I will share the results of the poll with you. In the meantime, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and I'm going to ask my colleagues just to flag some of the questions that you've been asking for all of us to answer. Thanks, folks. I hope you found that useful.
Leanne, I must say, some really good feedback coming through to your presentation. A lot better than mine, obviously. You know, the IT guy is always the boring one.
No, but that's not true. Just for the record, Stephen makes me look good.
So there's a whole lot of good feedback coming through. However, Bob has asked the question, and I think this is really important, and we get this quite often. What about soft skills training via screen? And what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And Bob, maybe you want to share some examples of the types of soft skills training that you're referring to. So if I think about some of our, and I know John Foster Pedley will want to comment on this as well. If I think about some of the soft skills, which I think are the hardest skills to actually impart, especially on virtual learning, one of the things that comes to mind is being able to demonstrate, for example, acute listening skills and empathy when you're engaging with a class, when you can see 25 people on screen only, and you still have a much larger class, as to how do you go about conveying that. And one of the best ways of doing that is really demonstrating that you're listening, responding in a way that doesn't show that you're the sage on stage, but that shows that you are interacting and that you are co-facilitating that discussion, perhaps even using coaching techniques. And when you're showing empathy, is to look at how you might use extensions. So breakout rooms, having one-on-one sessions, having peer feedback and peer coaching, and creating, if I think about Nancy Klein's work, and thinking councils to support each other in that. And I'm just using my own experience of it. Bob, if you have some specific examples of the soft skills that you're referring to, I'm sure John or Stephen would have picked it up on the chat as I'm talking. John, I can see you wanting to comment as well.
Yes, a little, not really, but happy to. Bob, I know very well. Bob's one of the leading outdoor and experiential educators that I know and have ever met. He works in France, and so I know he does a lot of this work. So Bob, I'm just wondering how to answer that in your context. It's obviously, yes. It's very hard to simulate the outdoor experience, but you know, as you know, I was a pilot, and pilots learn a lot of stuff in the flight simulator. So I think there's an awful lot of crew dynamics. I think you can create clever simulations. I think we'll get to that as we progress the virtual experience. Don't even have to use VR or anything for that. I think we'll get to surrogate methods of doing that. You can, by, as Leanne says, listening. You can do it by very good questioning. You can do it by breakouts. You can do it by giving people methods by which they talk and question each other in the breakout sessions. And you teach people to ask generative questions and not ask questions to which they know answers. So you can create some of those action learning methodologies and breakouts. And I think you can do it. And the truth is that we have very emotive experiences on the screen, on films. We cry, and the engagement with cell phones is greater than the engagement with TV. I heard a recent presentation say. So we really have the opportunity to develop emotive and effective learning through the screens. And I think, again, it's a matter of design, education, and further conversation. It's a good goal, though.
Stephen, any other questions that are coming through that we can help to answer?
I'm sort of digging through them. There's a lot of good feedback coming through, but you know, I'm just sort of looking if there's anything that's like an absolute specific question. There's one here that relates to the bit of your presentation where you were saying, you know, using different locations, indoor, outdoors, that kind of stuff. And somebody had asked about when encouraging people to use different locations, are you not worried about background noise? The thing, though, that I've seen within a platform like Zoom is there's some incredible settings in there to actually minimize and to artificially filter out a lot of the background noise. So perhaps next time before the session starts, Leanne, I'll show you where those settings are so we could keep the HODs out the background. But perhaps you had some thoughts on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things is to think about what is noise that is disruptive and what is noise that we can accommodate, because the more intolerant we become of distractions, then the less likely the learning is going to be impactful. So I think there's something about thinking about distracting noise versus noise that we should and can accommodate. So for example, we've got to be very cognizant of the level of stress that people feel when their kids are shouting in the background or when the dogs are barking in the background. And like I'm delivering a webinar now, I can't exactly say, I'll be right back, I need to shush the dogs up. So just think about how do you integrate life into it? And that's one of the things that I really appreciate and admire about Henley, is that the whole person is welcome at Henley. And what that means is that we mustn't be intolerant of people's lives, because if we are to be true and authentic in growing people that build the businesses that build Africa, then we have to accommodate and appreciate and, most importantly, celebrate everything that that person has in their lives. There are some clever tech things that we can do, other apps that can be added to Zoom platforms, for example, for noise cancelling, as an example. And so again, I would encourage you to think about how to use those aspects of life and sound and noise and distractions and movement of people walking behind, but also think about, you know, how do you make this learning experience truly memorable?
Wonderful, thank you so much.
If I may make a comment, Steve.
Sure, absolutely.
I'll take that. Yeah, thank you. So I just want to say hi to so many of our peers and colleagues in this game in Lagos Business School. Thank you for being here. Kenya in Siba, which I know very well, and I've taught there myself down in Cape Town with Jir and Lee and the team in the early days. Namibia as well, Hi Grafton and some of your people there. Boto in Botswana, I see you've got a great team with us. We'd love to talk to you more at any time. These are great institutions, all of them. So thank you for spending time with us. We are going to be running out of time shortly, I imagine. I just want to say, some people want us to do some more work with their teams internally. We extend this work. We've got quite a lot of it. So you can connect with us if you want us to do that. And we're very happy to do it as well. And that won't be a free seminar, but it won't be very expensive either, because we also have to make sure our time generates money, because we're a business school after all, and we have to do it. But we're giving away as much as we can for free. It's just time it's a problem if we do a lot of work with people. We've got a great team. You've seen Leanne, you've seen Steve. We've got some wonderful people, and Lita's going to summarize in a moment. But please keep firing the questions through. Again, this is a peer-to-peer thing. I'm fully understanding that all the people listening are experts in their own right and haven't got much of a voice right now. So it's humbling that you're listening to us, and thank you very much. But we're really in this together. So let's share more. Okay, thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you everyone that's been listening in on the webinar with your great comments. Can we hand over to Lita now, who will summarize for us what the last 90 minutes was about. Thank you, and over to you, Lita.
Excellent. Thank you, Mamo. Let me just share my screen. Can you see it, Mama? If you can give me an indication.
Not yet. It's just a black screen.
Okay, let me try it again. And they say when things can go wrong.
The IT people furiously trying to sort out the issues here, Lita.
Sometimes when it's supposed to work and it doesn't, it's one of those things. Hey, we're going to make it work just now. Right.
Cool. So while we wait for Lita's screen to show, I would just like to say that there is an evaluation that you can complete, especially if you would like us to offer these more in-depth workshops to your faculty and or to your department or your institution, and we're very happy to co-design these webinars if you feel that there's a need for us to do that. So feel free to just send us the feedback or contact us via my email address or through build2020.co.za.
Thank you for that, Mama. I am still trying to sort out.
Okay, well, we'll chat a bit. So, Lita, what you may do, if you've got JPEGs there, just send a JPEG to Leanne or me or Stephen or Mamo, and we can share our screens with them.
I'll do that. Let's give it 5 more seconds, John, if you can, and then we'll see if it will go through, because it did work before when we checked it.
So I think the summary of what we learned in all this was, while you're doing that, Lita, is that we thought it was going to be really hard to do, really, really tricky. And it was, but it was much more exciting than we thought. It was easier in some respects, but more difficult in other ways, in unexpected ways. The amount of collaboration we had to do, and the amount of other tools we had to use to work online, the dynamics of power hierarchies and academic institutions were tricky to deal with. Because we're used to passing messages up and down, and in this world, it's very flexible and fleet. We have to be able to, you really got to get used to working in this world. And if you're a senior manager in an academic institution, or, it's very easy to get out of touch. So you have to learn. Anyway, there we are. Thank you, Lita.
Good stuff. Great. Thank you so much. All right, guys. So as the presenters were talking through in the last hour and a half, I was capturing in a combination of words and pictures the main outcomes of what they've said. And I'd like to take the next 3 to 4 minutes just to go through what are some of those main insights in a summary. John spoke about what we've learned as they moved from face-to-face learning to almost 100% online learning. He spoke about the fact that we have to think about virtual education, fluency, agility, dynamics, how to manage the thing, how to be committed, how to have a blended approach. He also spoke about the fact that the Gini coefficient is also an education trap, but that education and intelligence is not the same thing. You can be very intelligent and not have the access to the education. And that really our focus at the moment is here around that low touch economy. He also spoke about the fact that we have to lift that learning curve. We were lagging behind anyway in terms of a learning deficit, but COVID is making this even harder. And that now at this particular time is the time to innovate. And it's not innovate around products, which is usually the way that we focus. It's innovation around our business models. And that is the stuff that will provide a return. He spoke about the particular language that we use in virtual learning, LMSs, asynchronous, synchronous, accreditation, all of those kind of things. But one of the main outcomes was we thought that we would lose a lot, but we actually lost a little bit of stuff, but we gained quite a lot. So that is a very quick summary, John, of your presentation. We then went into the technical bits with Stephen, the computer nerd, talking to us about how they've started out. It was literally a computer on a bar stool to accommodate someone who couldn't physically be in class. And we became more slick over time. But if you think about it, an educator doesn't mean much. We're educating children under trees. We can make it work. That you don't need the fancy or the expensive stuff. You really just need to use what you have access to. And he spoke about the story around how we moved the facilitators from facilitating in class or from the office to facilitating from their homes. And one of the main things that Stephen said was that good support is absolutely critical. Things are going to go wrong. If they do, it's okay, but you have to have that good support to make it work. He spoke about the hardware, whiteboard, dual monitors, the mic, the webcam, access to the internet, and he also shared some platforms around Zoom, BlueJeans, and you can read it there. And then what I thought was really cool is he spoke about how do we make it fun through things like Kahoot, through Animoto, and sometimes just using WhatsApp is also a way to make it a bit more interactive. So that's a quick summary of Stephen's presentation. And then Leanne spoke about the fact that the key lessons in designing and delivering training online. She shared her experience around the fact that if you turn into virtual learning, it's not just about converting things into videos or making the font bigger. It's actually a whole rethink of the approach that you take. She took us through Edgar Dale's cone of learning. How do we use this approach to make the learning memorable now that you don't have your learners physically with you in the same room? She also spoke about how do you include these 8 multiple intelligences in the design of the learning. It thinks you need to rethink completely in terms of how you apply that. She also made the link back into learning styles. There's 4 learning styles in terms of visual, auditory, reading and writing, and kinesthetic. How do you include these in an online session? We really have to think a little bit more creatively around that. And then I always like it when she talks about this, the new normal. Everything is done on a screen. Who is this new adult learner? And the fact that the adult learner's motivation is probably going to be the biggest pulling factor. And she linked it back to something called Pedagogy, where the learning is being pulled by the learners because they're interested, they want to be involved in that. She then went into quite a lot of detail around this particular model. And I remember her saying, if you take nothing else away from this, this is the thing that you have to take out. Think about in your learning design, what happens before, during, and after the learning? What happens inside the classroom? What happens outside the classroom? And how can you start breaking that down when you start thinking about how to design a particular learning intervention? She took us through the macro level designs. What would change in terms of your course goals, what you need to, the objectives that you need to achieve, how you would assess your teaching strategies and the tools. And also ask yourself a couple of questions around how do you make sure that on a micro level, people are connected to the content, the learners are connected to the facilitator and to the other learners. It's really around that connection. That's how people learn. Quite a good discussion around how do we assess and why do we assess? Do we need to assess? Ask yourself, how do we assess in this new world? What does that look like, and is that necessary? She also shared a couple of ideas around how will a recorded session land if someone watches it afterwards asynchronously. And then she gave us a couple of practical tips in terms of how do you manage a class online, making sure that you have enough breaks, that you have time away, people can go and take a body break. How do you mix it up as a facilitator? How do you move around scenery and movement? How do you change that out? The fact that time is not equal, and she used the example of having the learners decide how to schedule the time that they spend online with you. And then finally, acknowledging the shift and the transition. It's not easy, not for the learners, not for the facilitators, not for the people supporting. Take the time to connect with people and create and maintain those relationships. And then finally, she finished off with a checklist of 6 things around the blended learning, which I thought was quite a nice resource. So you'll be able to see that in the slides. And that is a very quick overview of Leanne's session. Mamo, thank you for that. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lita, and thank you so much for that beautiful summary. If anyone is wondering, yes, we will share this graphic harvested summary that Lita has put together for us. And if you are blown away by her skills, please feel free to get in touch with her. She'd be very happy to work with you at your institution.